In a small, isolated village nestled between the mountains and the river, there lived a man named Kofi. His life was a mystery to everyone around him, and it only deepened when he made a decision that shocked the entire village. One day, Kofi married his own reflection. At first, the villagers thought it was a strange joke, but as the days passed and Kofi remained committed to this odd marriage, the questions mounted. What drove him to such an unthinkable act? Was there something deeper, something the villagers were unaware of? If only they knew the real reason behind Kofi's decision, they would understand the true meaning of his actions. Kofi had always been an enigma in the village. His quiet demeanor, the way he moved through life without causing a stir, made him a subject of curiosity but never a focus of attention. He lived on the outskirts, not far from the village, in a modest hut where he tended to his work, maintaining his farm and livestock. The villagers spoke of him only in passing. He was a man of few words, the type who didn't seek companionship but rather kept to himself, content in his solitude. But that all changed the day he announced that he would be marrying. The news spread like wildfire. Kofi, who had never shown any interest in the women of the village, had caught everyone off guard. There was no courtship, no signs of affection toward any particular woman. The elders were baffled, the young women in the village wondered which man would finally win his heart, and the older men speculated that it might be a way for Kofi to secure his future. The question that everyone asked was, who was the lucky bride? The day of the ceremony arrived, and the village was abuzz with excitement. The villagers gathered at the central square, dressed in their best clothes, eager to witness the event. They assumed it would be a traditional wedding, full of the usual songs, dances, and feasts. But when Kofi arrived, all expectations were shattered. He walked alone, carrying a simple object wrapped in cloth, which he held close to his chest. The murmurs grew louder. No bride, no groom. What was going on? Kofi made his way to the small clearing by the river, where the ceremony was to take place. The village watched, waiting for him to reveal the bride. He stood still for a moment, then carefully unwrapped the cloth. A mirror. A plain, silver-framed mirror. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The villagers stared in disbelief, unsure of what they were seeing. Kofi, who had lived his life in solitude, had chosen to marry not a woman, but his own reflection. His own image. Is this a joke? Someone whispered from the crowd. Others looked at each other, not knowing whether to laugh or gasp in shock. But Kofi, undeterred by the confused stares, placed the mirror carefully in front of him and spoke with a calm that echoed through the silence. I vow to love and cherish this reflection, as I have always loved myself, unconditionally and without question. I choose to be true to who I am, to accept myself as I am, in this moment and every moment to come. The villagers stood frozen, unsure how to react. The women in the crowd exchanged glances, their faces a mix of confusion and surprise. The older men, who had seen many strange things in their time, shook their heads, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. Kofi had always been an outsider, but this was something none of them had expected. His choice was bizarre, yet it was unwavering, and he made no effort to explain himself further. As the ceremony progressed, the villagers watched in awe, trying to decipher the meaning behind Kofi's strange actions. The wedding was unlike any they had ever seen. No dancing, no singing, no traditional blessings from the elders. Just Kofi, standing in front of a mirror, pledging his love to an image of himself. The people remained uncertain, some whispering that Kofi had lost his mind, others wondering if there was a deeper meaning they hadn't yet uncovered. When the ceremony ended, the villagers dispersed, their minds full of questions. Some went home shaking their heads, believing that Kofi's actions were a sign of madness. Others, especially the younger generation, were more curious, intrigued by his mysterious behavior. Why had he chosen this path? Why had he not sought a bride, as any man in the village would have done. What had led him to this moment? In the days that followed, the villagers found themselves talking more and more about Kofi and his peculiar choice. They had known him as a quiet, distant figure, but never as one capable of such a shocking and unconventional act. The gossip spread like wildfire, each person adding their own twist to the story. Some believed that Kofi had fallen in love with his own image after years of solitude, while others thought that he had been hiding a secret love affair with a woman from another village, and this marriage was a form of escape. But none of these rumors answered the real question: why marry his reflection? As days turned into weeks, Kofi's behavior didn't change. He continued to live his life as he had always done, walking the land, tending to his animals, and going about his daily routines. The mirror remained at his side, and he often took it with him, placing it carefully wherever he went. He would talk to it as if it were a companion, sometimes smiling at the image that stared back at him, sometimes speaking softly to it as if it were listening. He seemed at peace, more at ease than he had ever been before. The villagers, too, began to shift their perceptions of Kofi. While they still didn't fully understand his choice, they started to view him with a sense of respect. They no longer saw him as a strange recluse, but as someone who had made a bold and personal decision. The younger villagers, especially, began to see Kofi as a symbol of self-love and acceptance. His choice to marry his reflection seemed to challenge the norms of the village, encouraging them to consider their own relationships with themselves. Yet, despite the growing respect, the mystery surrounding Kofi's decision remained. The villagers couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Kofi's story than met the eye. What was the real reason behind his marriage to his reflection? And would anyone ever truly understand the depth of his decision? The villagers couldn't stop talking about Kofi's strange marriage. As time passed, they tried to make sense of his actions, but nothing seemed to fit. They had grown up with the customs and traditions that governed the village's way of life, and Kofi's behavior seemed completely out of place. In a society where marriages were celebrated with feasts, dancing, and family gatherings, Kofi's wedding to a mirror was something they couldn't wrap their heads around. But the more the villagers spoke of it, the more the mystery deepened. The older men in the village, who had seen a great many things in their time, tried to reason with the younger villagers, explaining that Kofi's actions were perhaps a sign of rebellion, a challenge to the status quo. Others said it was an indication that he had finally lost his mind. There were whispers about how Kofi had always kept to himself, never engaging in conversations or forming bonds with others. Some speculated that he had spent too much time in isolation, and that it had driven him to the brink of madness. Yet, despite the gossip, there were a few who refused to believe the rumors. A few younger villagers, particularly those who had grown up watching Kofi quietly walk the fields and take care of his animals, began to see his actions in a different light. They believed there was more to his decision than simply a moment of madness or rebellion. They had watched him for years, observing the way he lived his life. There was always a certain sadness in his eyes, a look of longing that no one ever addressed. Kofi had never shown interest in the women of the village, and he had never spoken about his past or family. No one had ever really gotten close to him, but those who had the courage to ask him about his life were met with silence. Kofi had built walls around himself, walls that were impenetrable to the outside world. One of the younger villagers, a woman named Amma, was particularly intrigued by Kofi's decision. Unlike most of the other villagers, Amma had never been quick to judge. She had noticed the subtle pain in Kofi's eyes for years, and she had always wondered what had shaped him into the man he had become. While the others laughed or whispered behind his back, Amma remained curious and determined to understand him. She often found herself thinking about the mirror and the strange, quiet moments Kofi spent with it. It wasn't the act of marrying his reflection that fascinated her, but the reason behind it. Amma decided that she couldn't let this mystery remain unsolved. She would find a way to understand Kofi's decision, to learn why he had chosen this path. She waited for the right moment, watching Kofi from afar, until one day, she gathered the courage to approach him. It wasn't easy. Kofi was a man of few words, and he kept to himself most of the time, but Oma had spent enough time observing him to know that he wasn't completely closed off. She had seen the way he would sometimes glance at the village, as if wishing to be a part of something, to belong. She approached him one afternoon as he was sitting by the river, the mirror resting beside him on the ground. Kofi didn't notice her at first. He was lost in thought, staring at the reflection of the sky in the water. Oma hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. But then, taking a deep breath, she stepped closer and spoke. "Kofi, may I join you?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. Kofi looked up, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away but nodded slightly, signaling that she could sit with him. Oma lowered herself to the ground beside him, the two of them sitting in silence for a few moments. It wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet, the kind of silence that felt natural between two people who understood each other without words. After a while, Oma spoke again, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "Why did you marry your reflection, Kofi?" Kofi didn't respond immediately. He looked at the mirror for a long moment, then at the water flowing gently by. The question hung in the air between them, and for a second, Oma thought he wouldn't answer. But then, slowly, Kofi turned his head toward her, his eyes meeting hers. "You see," he began, his voice low, "I've spent most of my life alone. I never fit in with the villagers. I never found someone who truly understood me. There was always something missing, something that no one could give me. I spent years searching for meaning, trying to find a connection to the world around me, but the more I looked, the further it seemed to slip away." Oma listened carefully, her heart going out to him. She could sense the pain in his words, the longing that had been there all along, buried beneath the layers of silence he had kept. Kofi continued, "When I looked in the mirror, I didn't just see my face. I saw someone who had been waiting to be understood, someone who had been ignored, rejected, and misunderstood by the world. The reflection, my reflection, was the only thing that truly accepted me for who I was. It didn't judge me, didn't question me. It just was. So, I made a decision. I chose to marry that reflection because, for the first time in my life, I saw myself as I wanted to be seen. I wasn't trying to escape the world, I was trying to embrace myself, to love myself, in a way that no one else had ever allowed me to." Oma's heart ached as she listened to him. She realized that Kofi's decision wasn't a rejection of the village, but a desperate search for something he had never found in the eyes of others, acceptance. In his marriage to his reflection, he had chosen to accept himself when no one else had. It was an act of self-love, something the villagers couldn't understand because they had never seen the pain Kofi carried with him. "I see now," Oma said softly, her voice full of understanding. "You weren't marrying a reflection. You were marrying the person you needed to become. You were choosing yourself." Kofi nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his face. It was the first time Oma had seen him smile genuinely, and it filled her with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had broken through the wall he had built around himself. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the village, Kofi and Oma sat in peaceful silence. The village might never fully understand why Kofi had married his reflection, but Oma now saw the depth of his decision. It wasn't a strange or foolish act, it was a deeply personal journey of self-acceptance. And for the first time, Kofi had found peace. Days turned into weeks, and the villagers, though still confused, began to notice something different in the way Kofi carried himself. There was a calmness about him, a peacefulness that hadn't been there before. He had always been solitary, but now, he seemed more content, more at ease with himself. He no longer appeared burdened by the isolation that had once defined his life. His daily routines, though unchanged, were filled with a quiet confidence. He walked with his head held a little higher, as if the act of marrying his reflection had liberated him in ways no one could fully understand. Omar, who had now become his confidant, continued to visit Kofi by the river. They spoke more often, and with each conversation, Omar learned more about the man behind the mirror. Kofi shared stories of his youth, tales of unspoken desires, and years of feeling like an outsider in the village. His words were often accompanied by a sadness, but there was also a sense of peace, as if he had finally come to terms with the isolation he had lived with for so long. "I spent years trying to fit in," Kofi confessed one afternoon, as the two sat in the warm glow of the setting Sunday, "but the harder I tried, the more I felt like a stranger to myself. It wasn't the village that rejected me. It was my own inability to accept who I truly was." Omar listened intently, her heart aching for him. She had never realized just how deep Kofi's pain ran. To the outside world, he had always been the quiet, distant man, the one who kept to himself. But behind that calm exterior, there was a man who had been struggling for years, trying to find a place where he belonged. Now, with his reflection as his only companion, he had found something that the world had never offered him: acceptance. "Do you think the villagers will ever understand?" Amma asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Kofi paused for a moment, considering her question. He knew the villagers would never truly understand. They couldn't, not without walking in his shoes, not without experiencing the loneliness and frustration he had endured. But that no longer bothered him. He had found peace within himself, and that was more important than anything the village could offer. "I don't need them to understand," Kofi said, his voice steady. "I only need to understand myself. And for the first time in my life, I do." Omar smiled gently at him, feeling a deep sense of admiration for Kofi. She had watched him grow from a man who had lived in the shadows, avoiding the world, into someone who had found the courage to embrace who he truly was. It wasn't about the village or the people in it. It was about Kofi's journey to self-acceptance. The villagers, meanwhile, began to notice the change in Kofi as well. Some of them, particularly the younger generation, began to approach him with a new sense of respect. They could see that there was something different about him, though they still didn't fully understand the reasons behind his actions. They began to see Kofi as a figure of mystery, a man who had chosen a path that was not defined by the expectations of others. The older villagers, however, remained skeptical. They continued to gossip about Kofi's strange behavior, questioning his sanity and making wild assumptions about his marriage to his reflection. But even they couldn't ignore the fact that Kofi seemed more at peace than he had ever been. His quiet, solitary nature had not changed, but now, there was a sense of calm that emanated from him, a quiet confidence that seemed to come from deep within. One day, as Kofi walked through the village, a young man named Kwame approached him. Kwame had always admired Kofi from a distance, but like many others, he had never fully understood the man's actions. Today, however, was different. "Kofi," Kwame said, his voice respectful, "I've been thinking about what you did. And I want to understand. Why did you marry your reflection?" Kofi looked at Kwame, his expression thoughtful. He had always been a man of few words, but something about Kwame's sincerity made him feel the need to share the truth. "Because, Kwame," Kofi began slowly, "I had to learn to love myself before I could love anyone else. I had spent so much time trying to gain the approval of others, trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for me. But in the end, I realized that I had to accept myself for who I was, flaws and all. The reflection in the mirror was the only thing that accepted me without question. It wasn't about vanity, it wasn't about looking at myself and thinking I was better than others. It was about finding peace with who I am. And when I did that, when I truly accepted myself, everything changed. Kwame stood there for a moment, processing Kofi's words. It was the first time he had ever heard Kofi speak so openly about his inner struggles. For the first time, he understood that Kofi's decision wasn't about rejecting the village or the people in it, it was about Kofi finding a way to reconcile with himself. I see now, Kwame said, nodding slowly. You weren't just marrying your reflection. You were choosing to be at peace with yourself, something many of us struggle to do. Kofi smiled faintly, a look of gratitude crossing his face. Yes, he said simply. And sometimes, the hardest part of life is accepting who you are. The rest follows from there. Kwame left the conversation with a new perspective. He had always thought of Kofi as an outsider, a man who didn't fit in with the village. But now, he saw him as someone who had found something that many people in the village had yet to discover, inner peace. Kofi had found freedom, not in rebellion, but in acceptance of himself. And that was something worth admiring. As the days passed, Kofi's decision became less of a mystery to the villagers. While they might never fully understand the depth of his choice, they began to respect it. Kofi had taught them a valuable lesson, not in words, but in his actions. He had shown them that true peace comes from within, that the key to living a fulfilled life was accepting yourself, flaws and all. And in a world that constantly pressures individuals to conform, Kofi's journey was a powerful reminder that sometimes, the greatest act of courage is to love yourself just as you are. In time, Kofi's marriage to his reflection became less of a shock and more of a symbol of self-acceptance. The village, once skeptical, had slowly begun to understand the message he had been trying to send all along, that the love we seek from others must first come from within. Kofi, the man who married his reflection, had found the freedom he had been searching for all his life, and in doing so, he had shown the villagers how to do the same. As time passed, Kofi's life in the village gradually shifted. What had initially been a source of confusion and curiosity for the villagers had transformed into a quiet symbol of strength. Kofi had always been a figure who stood apart, but now, his solitude was seen as a reflection of his inner peace. The village had watched him for years, unsure of who he truly was or what motivated him. But through his decision to marry his own reflection, Kofi had opened a door to a deeper understanding of himself, and in doing so, had sparked a broader change in the village. The villagers, who had once regarded him as strange or distant, began to see Kofi in a new light. He wasn't just the quiet man who kept to himself anymore. He had become a figure of wisdom, someone who had found peace in a way that many of them still struggle to achieve. Kofi's marriage to his reflection wasn't an act of madness or rebellion, it was an act of self-acceptance. He had chosen to embrace himself fully, something many of the villagers had never truly done. Amma, who had grown closer to Kofi over the past few months, watched the change unfold in the village. She had always believed there was more to Kofi's decision than met the eye, but now, she saw that the true significance of his choice had touched everyone around him. It wasn't just Kofi who had transformed, the village itself was beginning to change as well. The once constant gossip and judgment had shifted into a quiet respect. The villagers no longer saw him as an outsider, but as someone who had shown them a different path, one that involved self-reflection, self-acceptance, and inner peace. Amma spent many afternoons with Kofi, sitting by the river or walking through the fields, talking about the lessons he had learned and how he had come to make the decision that had turned his life around. She asked him one day, "Kofi, do you think the village will ever truly understand why you did what you did? Will they ever grasp the depth of your choice?" Kofi looked out across the river, his face thoughtful. "Maybe," he said, "but it's not for them to understand. I did it for me, and that's all that matters. People have their own journeys, their own struggles. If my decision can teach them anything, it's that they need to stop seeking approval from others and start accepting themselves as they are." But that's a lesson each person has to learn in their own time. Omar nodded, our respect for Kofi growing with each passing day. He had never sought the approval of others. He had chosen himself when the world had asked him to conform, and in doing so, he had found something that many in the village had been searching for their entire lives: peace. His marriage to his reflection had been more than just a symbolic act, it had been a powerful declaration of self-love, something that many of the villagers struggled to give themselves. Kofi's daily routine remained the same. He woke early, tended to his animals, and walked the land. He still spent time with the mirror, speaking to his reflection as if it were a companion, but now, there was a different energy about him. He no longer seemed consumed by loneliness or self-doubt. His actions were deliberate and grounded in his new understanding of himself. He had come to the realization that true freedom came not from others but from within. It was the freedom to love oneself without needing validation from the outside world. As the months passed, the village began to embrace this new way of thinking. While not everyone understood Kofi's marriage to his reflection, they started to recognize the quiet strength he radiated. Some of the younger villagers began to approach him, seeking advice about life, relationships, and finding one's own path. Kofi, who had never been a teacher, found himself offering guidance to those who asked. His words were simple but filled with wisdom, as if he had unlocked something in himself that had always been hidden. One day, as Kofi sat by the river, a young man named Kwame approached him. Kwame had always been curious about Kofi's choice but had been too afraid to ask. He had grown up in the village, surrounded by the same expectations and pressures that everyone else faced. He had never known the kind of peace that Kofi seemed to possess, and he wondered if it was something he could find for himself. Kofi, Kwame said hesitantly, I've been thinking a lot about your decision. You married your reflection, and you found peace in that. But I don't know how to find peace in my own life. I'm always worried about what others think of me, and I can't seem to get rid of that fear. Kofi turned to him, his eyes soft with understanding. Kwame, the first step is to stop worrying about what others think. People will always have opinions, and they'll always judge you based on their own experiences. But it's up to you whether you let those judgments define you. You have to learn to accept yourself first. You are enough, just as you are. Kwame looked down, contemplating Kofi's words. He had always been so focused on trying to fit in with the village's expectations, trying to prove himself to others, that he had forgotten the most important part, himself. He realized, for the first time, that his happiness wasn't dependent on others' approval. What if I don't know who I am? Kwame asked. What if I'm lost? Kofi smiled gently. You're not lost, Kwame. You just need to take the time to look inward. The answers are already within you. It might take time, but once you accept yourself, once you stop pretending to be someone you're not, you'll find the peace you're searching for. Kwame nodded slowly, feeling a shift inside himself. Kofi's words had struck a chord with him. The idea of self-acceptance, of loving oneself without seeking approval from others, was a powerful one. He had spent his whole life chasing external validation, but Kofi had shown him a different way, a way of peace that came from within. As the days passed, Kwame began to apply Kofi's teachings to his own life. He started to embrace his true self, letting go of the fears and insecurities that had held him back. The village, too, began to change. Slowly, but surely, the people started to focus more on self-reflection and self-love. They stopped judging Kofi for his unconventional marriage and started to understand the deeper message he had been sending. Kofi had not just married his reflection. He had married himself, embracing all that he was, flaws and all. And through that act of self-love, he had taught the village a valuable lesson about the importance of accepting oneself. It was a lesson that would stay with them for generations, a reminder that peace is not something we find in the approval of others, but in the acceptance of who we are. Kofi had found the freedom to live authentically, and in doing so, he had given the village the greatest gift of all, the power to do the same. As time went on, Kofi's influence in the village became undeniable. What started as an act that had baffled and perplexed the villagers slowly grew into a profound lesson in self-acceptance. The ripples of his decision spread far beyond his own life, touching every corner of the village. The villagers, once so quick to judge him for marrying his reflection, had come to understand that Kofi's actions were not the product of madness or a desire for isolation. Instead, they were the manifestation of a deeply personal journey, a journey of embracing one's true self. In the weeks following Kofi's conversation with Kwame, a quiet transformation began to take place. The younger villagers, particularly those who had once mocked or whispered about Kofi, began to approach him in a different light. They now sought him out for advice, not just about love or relationships, but about how to live a life of integrity and peace. The notion of self-love, which had once seemed foreign to them, began to take root. Oma, who had been Kofi's confidant and a silent observer of the change, noticed this shift. She watched as the villagers, especially the younger generation, began to see their own reflections in a different way. They weren't just looking at themselves in the mirror anymore. They were beginning to understand that true peace came not from external validation but from within. It was a realization that had been hidden in plain sight, but it took Kofi's unusual act to bring it into the light. Oma spoke with Kofi often, sometimes late at night, under the stars, when the world seemed to slow down, and everything felt quiet and still. During one of these conversations, she asked him about the deeper meaning of his actions. Kofi, now that the village is changing, I wonder if you've ever thought about how far-reaching your decision was. You married your reflection, yes, but in doing so, you've helped the rest of us see ourselves clearly, too. Have you thought about that? Kofi sat silently for a moment, looking out at the land he had walked for so many years. His eyes were calm, his demeanor thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. I never thought about how my choice would affect others. At the time, it was just about me. I had to do it for myself, to love myself, to stop living for the expectations of others. But I've seen what it's done for the village, for Kwame, and for you. And I've come to understand something important. Sometimes, in order to show others how to love themselves, we have to first learn how to love ourselves. My reflection was the only thing that didn't judge me, didn't tell me who I should be. It was me at my truest form, untainted by the world. Amma nodded, her heart swelling with admiration. It's not just that you showed them how to love themselves, Kofi. You've shown them that they can live authentically, without fear. You've taught us all that our worth isn't determined by what others think of us, but by how we choose to see ourselves. The realization hung in the air like the evening fog, both heavy and freeing. Kofi had not only changed his own life, but had subtly and profoundly changed the course of the village's future. His personal journey of self-acceptance had led to a collective awakening, one that would continue long after his time. He had shown them that life wasn't about pleasing others or conforming to a mold. It was about being true to one's essence and living fully in the moment, unburdened by fear or regret. One afternoon, as the village gathered at the central square for a feast, a celebratory event that had become more frequent since Kofi's transformation, the villagers honored him. They spoke not only of his wisdom but of the courage it took to make such an unconventional choice. Kofi, ever humble, stood at the center of the gathering, surrounded by those who had once looked down on him. He had become a symbol, not of rebellion or madness, but of strength and authenticity. Kwame, who had grown from a curious young man to one of the village's leaders, stood beside him. He raised his voice above the crowd and said, "Kofi has taught us all a powerful lesson. It's not always the world that needs to change. Sometimes, we need to look inward, accept who we truly are, and live authentically." Only then can we make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of others. The crowd cheered, and Kofi smiled, his heart full of gratitude. He never wanted the spotlight, but the recognition felt different now. It was not the recognition of a man who sought approval, but the acknowledgement of someone who had finally made peace with himself. And in doing so, he had become a beacon for others to follow. Oma, standing off to the side, watched the scene unfold. She had seen Kofi's journey from the beginning, and now, as the village gathered around him, she realized just how far he had come. The act of marrying his reflection, once seen as a curious and strange decision, had become the catalyst for an incredible transformation. It had not only helped Kofi find himself but had allowed the entire village to begin the process of looking inward and accepting themselves for who they truly were. Kofi had spent so many years in solitude, avoiding the world's judgment and expectations. Now, after marrying his reflection and learning to accept himself, he had finally discovered that true peace could only come from within. The villagers had learned from his example. And though they could never fully understand his choice, they respected the lessons it had taught them. In the months that followed, the village flourished in ways it never had before. People spoke more openly about their struggles and insecurities, and there was a growing sense of empathy among the villagers. The fear of judgment, once so prevalent, began to fade. People began to live their lives with more authenticity, more purpose. They no longer lived in the shadow of others' opinions but embraced their own truths. Kofi, now regarded as the wise elder of the village, continued to live peacefully by the river. The mirror remained his constant companion, a reminder of his journey and the lessons he had learned. And though he was no longer a young man, his heart remained full of the wisdom and peace he had gained over the years. As the sun set over the village, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Kofi sat by the river, his reflection in the water a symbol of the peace he had found. The villagers, gathered in the distance, went about their lives, but Kofi knew that the village would never be the same. It had changed for the better. And for that, he was grateful. His decision to marry his reflection had been the key to unlocking a world of possibilities, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Kofi had married his reflection, and in doing so, he had married life itself, the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the painful. And he had learned that in accepting all parts of himself, he could finally be free.